Current situation in the Strait of Hormuz demonstrates the strategic and economic value of keeping the world's waterways open to trade. Yes, those waterways are strategic military arenas, but they are equally important to every business around the world. What happens on the water affects what happens on land. Supply chains are at risk, economies are in peril, along with national defense. Welcome to Security Disruptors, the maritime domain, and economic security, what every CEO, investor, and policymaker should know and care about. Joining us today is retired two-star Admiral of the U.S. Navy, Mike Studeman. Mike is recognized as a global expert on maritime transport, and his position is the backbone of international trade. A UN Trade and Development report states that over 80%, and some claim it is higher, of the volume of international trade is transported over the world's oceans and seas. For many, maritime security is seen as a naval issue, but maritime professionals know that is not true. Today's conversation is about providing information to industry and policymakers that will inform them about the scope and value of maritime systems. As well, I'm joined by Calvin Chrustie, the co-founder of Critical Risk Team in Vancouver. For those of you who are watching us online and wish to submit a question, please go to slido.com. Mike, welcome.
Thanks, Jan. It's good to see you and look forward to a stimulating conversation about maritime things.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I think that if we take a look at what is shifting on the seas right now, from your perspective, over the past 3 decades, what has changed regarding maritime security? And maybe a better question would be, has our focus changed both in targets and in locations or arenas that we're operating in?
Well, I think it depends on where you are coming from, because if you've long been in the maritime industry, you've understood its value and its importance. And I think the change is really what the public understands about the importance of the maritime world. I think they took it for granted. I think that most people didn't understand, where their supply chains operated and what it took to actually create sort of the modern economies of today. And now I think the scales have been removed from those eyes, the veil has been lifted, and the general public has more of a sense. They may not fully understand the industry, it's a very complex thing, but I do think that they understand that, wow, there are dependencies that I have learned about that are astonishing in how they can affect my wallet and my livelihood. And so in that respect, I do think we've been able to reduce, I don't think we've eliminated it, but we've reduced what we've called in the Navy sea blindness. And I think that's a net good thing for us, because we have to have more conversations in many countries about what it will take to actually manage our maritime trade, what we need to invest in terms of capital infrastructure, and how we're going to manage this increasingly volatile world where maritime trade can quickly become a victim.
So in my opening question, I was sort of asking, did we change our focus? If we take a look at the focus of security over the last 20 plus years, there was at one point a tremendous amount of attention on terrorism. And then we switched to cyber. But what we're now seeing is the dramatic impact of economic coercion. And when we look at the role of maritime trade, economic coercion is a theater in which what happens on the seas can have just profound effects.
Yes, I think so. Although, in my opinion, we are highly distracted on a number of different fronts. And so I don't think that there's a universal view of how to rank order the priorities that we talk about. Terrorism hasn't gone away. We have to invest a certain amount of capability to make sure that we don't end up with a number of homeland attacks, and need to protect our interests against that threat stream. But it turns out that there are other threat streams as well that are nation state based, and other non-state actor, non-terrorist. Houthis are a good example. And so I think the whole conversation about gray zone, which is below the threshold of war, if white zone is peacetime, and black zone is wartime. Well, then gray zone somewhere in between. And people, nation states are organizing to deal with that. And it has risen, I think, in the public's consciousness there. But is there a politician today that is able to actually provide a framework to their people where they can fully understand these threat streams and to understand their hierarchy and the priorities and then connect a investment schema to it and a long range sort of campaign? Frankly, I haven't seen that yet across many different countries, leadership teams. I hope we get to see that, but I think people are mainly confused. And today they see a lot of threats, but they may not be able to see clearly about, what to do with it, how to manage it, and where we're going as a country in confronting them.
Calvin?
Mike, I was just going to ask, it's been heavily introduced in the narrative in the media, national security is economic security is national security. And as you just alluded to, there's all these different domains, gray zone tactics or hybrid threat vectors and activities. But when we look at the maritime systems, like how does organized crime, cyber, economic coercion converge, from your perspective in the maritime domain?
Yeah, I think that when you have ungoverned spaces, whether a non-state actor or a state actor can use and exploit those for various purposes, for organized crime, it may be simply conveyance of goods, transportation, whether it's moving illicit timber or human smuggling or narcotics, or it's getting guns back, for example, from the United States back into South America, that those areas which have been essentially undergoverned, vast spaces that are hard to sense, hard to put an asset to interdict, be able to identify what deserves to be interdicted. Those things are now being discussed as areas where perhaps technology allows us to do better. And I do think that we have the full spectrum of things that we're going to have to deal with, from the nation state, large maritime forces. And I use the word maritime force purposely because it includes not just navies and warships, but also sort of the maritime commercial industries of nation states and what that provides to them, and what those ships may do in terms of shadow fleets or ghost fleets, et cetera, that may be part of the hybrid warfare problem, but also all the way down to the non-state actors. How do you actually get your arms around this? And this is like a multiple simultaneous problem. Convergence exists on any given day. It is fully converged. Um, there are plenty of different connections that exist between, certain actors that are transnational criminal organizations and some members of officialdom in nation states, right? And so the convergence is what creates the stickiness of this problem. And how do you tackle this? It's not just interdicting a boat on the sea, when in fact what you're doing in that case of narco trafficking, you're going after the foot soldiers. How do you actually get to the financiers and the corrupt politicians that may be enabling, that traffic and supporting it from inside a government, right? Because that's actually how that works in Latin America, Central America, et cetera. So this problem is a much more complex than some would make it out to seem. It's not just what happens on the water. If you want to deal with these issues, it crosses the land-sea sort of interface, land-sea cyber interface.
How do we do that? What is the best strategy for us to be able to cross that barrier?
Well, in my view, we need to have, like every leader of any country, they need to have a conversation with the country about the threats and rank order them and make sure that they're actually strategically sound, that they make sense. Now, national security strategies are what we do when we have a new president that issues what they think about the world. But frankly, this national security strategy that we have now may not be as clear-sighted as some of the other ones before. So we have an issue where we have to name our threats and our adversaries. Russia is not a friend of the United States, right? And it gets very little treatment in our current national security strategy. Russia and China and North Korea and Iran, the so-called CRINC players, right? And their clients and some of their partners in the global South are transforming the world in ways that deserve a conversation, at least within the United States, but other countries as well. So we're seeing a world in transition. We're seeing a global order that is being deconstructed with America's hand in dismantlement as probably the heaviest hand in it. And we are seeing positioning by other countries to recreate something that's going to be more conducive, more friendly to their preferences. This is a framework that the American people and other peoples could understand, but frankly, that's not sort of how the world is presented to us. And so we have a very difficult time of it if our leadership can't help see the world for what it is and then be able to say, okay, the top priorities will be unfriendly nation states that work together to transform a world which is not in the best interests of our security and prosperity. And then maybe you work your way down, and I think you get to your transnational organized crime terrorists and other issues that are in the threat spectrum, in the right place. And then from there, right, then you apply the resources that are going to be required over multiple administrations to be able to take care of these problems. And they're not going to be solved so much as they're going to be mitigated and managed. And that expectation setting needs to also come from the president. Are we going to stamp out narco-terrorism, narco-trafficking? Are we going to eliminate a threat from China's rise and their, more aggressive stance in the world? No, right? But the American people, I don't think have had a conversation like I'm describing, but I think they deserve one. I think the world deserves to have good leadership that actually allows you to see very lucidly exactly what's transforming at the macro scale and how, yes, indeed, security has come back with a vengeance, where before we could focus primarily on profits and economies. Now everything has to be viewed through a securitized lens because that's the world we live in now.
So we live in democratic countries, the United States and Canada. The policymakers and politicians that determine where they're going to go are driven much by what the public narrative is. Why do you think that the public narrative does not fully appreciate or wants to accept the threats and risks that are at play? We're not having those conversations that you say are so important. And so it affects policymakers, but then it also has to affect the thinking of especially major corporations.
Yeah, I lament about that. I'm waiting for better leaders to emerge on the scene. I can't point to, across multiple administrations, not a political statement here. I haven't seen leaders do it very well, particularly in light of some of the domestic travails that people are going through. And look, most people elect their leadership based on kind of their own local, parochial, maybe their own economic condition. It's not based on foreign policy issues typically, right? And so, people rise to the top who appear to be able to try to answer main concerns that people have about their checkbook and their prospects and their opportunities inside each country. If you over exaggerate threats or you misattribute why the problems exist, then you have, I think, a very, very difficult starting point. And we've seen that in the polemics that have existed. Instead of focusing on country per se, we have excessive partisanship. So I think that's part of the problem. A second problem, I think, is that most of the leaders that we seem to be electing just don't have a lot of international experience, or it's not in their bones, it's not in their DNA. And so it's not always true, but I do think that's also a challenge. If you're coming late to a high official position where you still have to be educated, maybe you never quite learned some of the fundamentals, particularly, let's say, in economics, which are very complicated. Then it can be tough going. And then I also think that leaders have a hard time holistically connecting, sort of in a universal explanation, a causal way, how something afar can maybe affect you in Main Street, USA, or Main Street, Canada. I think that takes a very special skill in terms of your ability to communicate, how you can describe how a faraway problem can actually radiate and have consequences at your kitchen table. And you really need enlightened people to do that. It's not easy, but those are the kind of people I think we're going to have to elect and put in positions of significance there, because we're going to have to unify around some of these challenges. So long as we remain divided and maybe at each other's throats and we've misidentified the problems, then all it does is gives opportunity and sort of a winning prospect for many of these threat streams that we need to deal with.
You know, I've heard you speak about the power of dialogue or discourse power and how our adversaries use it. They understand that what's happening in North America affects them, and they want to affect the public perception. They're very good at crafting messages and sharing them on an ongoing basis, which then affects the domestic consumption of perceptions of threat. And what the long-term objectives of some of our adversaries are. And so we get a distorted view. I find, and I know that you've spoken about this, why is it that we are reluctant to engage in those same kinds of conversations that are highlighting the threats and risks that are at play within, like not just coming externally, but from within North America?
Well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist here, though this will sound like it. But anybody who studied China and looked at their importance that they've placed on propaganda and how they've externalized so much propaganda that they perfected internal, talking about the Chinese Communist Party, has been able to actually do some very significant elite capture in the United States and in other Western governments. It's fascinating. There's a book called Red Handed, the guy named Schweitzer wrote a few years ago. And Red Handed describes in the United States and Canada, like how successful the Chinese have been in compromising academic institutions. Yale was, one of the top ones, but also others, research grants, tuition dollars, et cetera, influencing the nature of debate and the kind of academic freedom or lack thereof, impingement on it at university campuses, all the way through political elites, their family members, how much they've done business with the Chinese and want to curry favor and continue to do so. Tech bros, a lot of others on that current list that you can probably imagine. And then in terms of Hollywood, having entertainment capture, where you have the Chinese that essentially silenced Hollywood to participate in exposing China's stratagems, activities around the world. And so the Chinese have been there. It's not as if it's not something we're just not doing on our own. We are actively being suppressed with intentional tactics by the Chinese. To a lesser extent, the Russians try to be spoilers and try to have us fight one another and internally divide us and use the information domain to do that. The Chinese are there as well in many respects, but their strategy has been more sophisticated. It's been multi-decade, and it's been highly successful. And no American president, Democrat or Republican, have ever dared to talk about what I just talked about. And yet it's well documented. It's out there for anybody that wants to scratch the surface. You'll find something that is tremendously disappointing in terms of how we've been able to keep at bay these foreign adversary efforts to stifle the conversations that we need to have about the nature of other nation states' rise, particularly China, and what it means for us. And so long as they continue to have essentially their hands over our information throats, they'll continue to make advances, and we'll continue to, I think, roil in our own waters. without identifying exactly what we're going to need to do to confront our future.
And does that then leave us blind to the threats that are amassing against us? Because if we take a look at what the PRC naval objectives are and the way in which they are growing their Navy, it's significant, but it's not covered much here, and we don't recognize on a public level what the threat is, especially coming out of the Indo-Pacific region.
There are people that get it. I mean, there's been an awakening. I've seen a change. I mean, I struggled starting 25, 30 years ago to talk about the implications of a China that, for me, the course was pretty clear. And people just didn't want to believe it, even as the threat became more manifest. Now, more people are aware. You can find journalists that have covered these things well, but so long as the political class and the entertainment class and the academic class doesn't get their act together and also say it, then it doesn't get reinforced and doesn't become part of our mantra. It doesn't become accepted conventional wisdom. And so you have these little pockets of excellence. Think tanks are doing great work. Some academics are doing the same. Some journalists are right on top of all this, but it's all sort of drip by drip. It's like little stovepipes of insight that aren't cohered in a way where people can understand it. And that's a job of, I think, primarily politicians, but it's amazing how much, if you look back at our Cold War Soviet era, how important Hollywood and the entertainment industry was for defining the Russian Soviet threat and what we need to do as a society to work together to deal with it. None of that coherence currently exists. But if you go to Congress and you talk to the CCP Special Committee under Mulinar, Rep. Mulinar, or you go and talk to the Economic and Security Commission on China, they are fully on top of this. They are diagnosing the problems accurately. They've been doing so for years. They propose legislation. Some of it's been passed, some of it's been very good, and other legislation is sort of pending or is yet to be acted on because other politics sort of get in the way of prioritizing those bills. And that's where we've fallen short. In some cases, we've fallen short because we've passed bills, some export control laws, for example, but we don't enforce them, or there are waivers or things like that, where the executive branch has failed to do its job. Let me give you an example. When it comes to the way that China steals intellectual property, right? This is not just activities done by CIA equivalents, the Ministry of State Security, by people trained in espionage. That's not the Chinese approach. It's a million grains of sand. It's a lot of people in a lot of different places who are not agents, but who are either they're solicited for their information that has sort of trade secrets or scientific insights, or they give it back to the motherland or their friends, or they sell it to try to get a better job in China when they go back. And they may be educated here, they may be in U.S. research labs, et cetera. And we have a government approach, which is to say, well, we've got the FBI and we've got counterintelligence officers there, and we have some in the military, but by and large, what we're facing is sort of a flood of access by non-agents inside our society that are exploiting and moving our intellectual property over to China. And that's one of the reasons why the rise has been so fast. And we have failed to discuss what it's going to take to have a public-private partnership to be able to be more vigilant, to be able to screen people before they come into companies, for example, to monitor inside fairly, equitably, and then to rapidly deal with consequences of those who lead to IP breaches. That's a worthy conversation to be had within the United States. Government can't do it all. It's been proven to be the case. The Chinese still steal $250 to $600 billion of IP a year. And so we are a sieve, and we haven't had a conversation about what it's going to take to be able to be more secure in this regard.
So coming back to our topic about, if you rule the seas, you rule the world. We're hearing that earlier this month, the U.S. Navy started to reposition its North Atlantic fleet with a focus on the South China Sea, Indo-Pacific. What does that signal?
Well, these are big questions. I don't want to overread into any current, positioning of assets. We have to have a balanced force across different theaters, and so I would caution against people who worry about sort of European full-on abandonment. I think there currently, is a trend to say, hey, let's force Europe to see that it needs to provide for its own defense and encourage more defense spending, et cetera. And look, even before this administration came in, the Europeans were spending more on defense. So that Ukraine was in their face for a couple of years. They were starting to do that in significant ways. So the wake-up call was Russia's wake-up call, not necessarily Washington's, even amidst the current pressure. So their trend line had been good. It can be better. The Europeans have organized for success in a variety of different ways. I take, for example, a good sign about the Joint Expeditionary Force, which the UK, leads out of Northwood, which is made up of 10 countries that are looking at not just conventional deterrence, but also dealing with Russia's hybrid approaches, attacking subsea infrastructure, for example, using the Shadow Fleet. And those 10 countries in the northern tier have been able to actually organize on issues that are less than sort of, NATO's Article 5 and have created a greater presence and been able to more directly deal with, Russia's tactics and some of their threats up in the Northern Atlantic, in the Baltics, and North Sea, and the Barents, et cetera. So that's a good sign. So burden sharing is occurring. I would hate for us to pull back out of Rhoda or Italy or Germany, some of the UK, other bases there. We will need those places and stations and bases to be able to support our interests and the mutual security interests of ourselves and the Europeans for future contingencies. So it would be foolish to fully retract there, in my humble opinion. At the same time, I've long been in favor of concentrating on the Pacific, just like we used to say in the teens, beginning in the first Obama administration about the pivot and the balance, the rebalance. And it was always sort of more rhetoric than substance, unfortunately. Even in the 20s, when I was the director of intelligence at Indo-Pacific, I felt like it was a struggle in 2020 and 2021 and 2022 to convince Washington that we needed to do more in the Pacific. And it was a tooth and nail sort of fight against other things, even post GWAT. So look, I do think we have to have a conversation about where our forces need to be. The fact of the matter is the Chinese are very aggressive. They are expansionists. They have proven that what's theirs is theirs and they'll defend it to the death, and what's yours is theirs too. Notably by, you see their sort of moves east of Taiwan, well east of Taiwan, beyond 200 nautical miles, to sort of say, hey, Japan and the Philippines, when you negotiated this midline boundary between the exclusive economic zones, we want a piece of that action too. And so they've stepped out to show their true colors, which is to say they understand the importance of all things maritime to their wealth and to their security. The Chinese are more Mahanian than any other nation state that I can see today, which is to say, and I'll turn it back over to you, which is to say that they see that the importance to a country of things maritime is absolutely essential, especially for any great power. And maritime does not mean just naval forces, warships. Maritime means having commercial maritime capability, and the Chinese have been going gangbusters in creating it, and they're the leading country in the world now in maritime affairs, right? Because of their investments over time, a strategy that they developed, 25, 30 years ago, which has now come to fruition, and they continue to invest there. They understand the centrality of the oceans, controlling sea lines, commerce, et cetera, guaranteeing access to markets, to be able to pull in raw materials a la Belt and Road. And we have nothing similar to such a sort of vision for China's future even despite sort of Trump's maritime action plan, which is still sort of struggling to get off the ground. Over.
Is one of our challenges the dramatic scale of territory that particularly North America has to be concerned with, because in the map that's behind you, we can see you've got the Atlantic on one side, the Pacific on the other, and to defend and to operate in those arenas that you're giving safe maritime passage to commercial vessels and guarding against national security, the scale is so significant. China has a much more narrow and compact geography that they can build out from and then radiate from. Does that give them in some ways an interesting advantage where they choose to go?
Well, their interests are global. I mean, I do think that on certain contingencies that relate to sort of Taiwan, South China Sea, Kakus, Yellow Sea contentions, with South Korea, on those areas which could lead into major power conflict, clearly the advantage exists to China in terms of interior lines, proximity, the ability to resupply, replenish, have a density of sensors and shooters and things like that. So that's a problem, which means that we need to be able to, the Chinese talking about anti-access area denial. We won't be able to gain superiorities or supremacies, at least not for very long, in any kind of, future warfare environment. God forbid we get into that. But we also need to have sufficient capability forward to be able to do the same thing that they described to us, A2AD, that we would deny to them. Thus, we need to have the ability to put a lot of weapons in a short amount of time, prompt strike from Taiwan, Philippines, Japan, and from the sea to be able to deter Xi Jinping from being tempted to use a military solution to resolve his political problem of Taiwan. So that aside, China's Belt and Road requires, a global footprint, and thus the Chinese expansion of, owning and operating so many commercial ports there. The plan is, like I said, totally Mahanian, who recommended that in order to have global access, to be able to ensure that you can protect your arteries and the lifeblood that comes into your country, you need to have that kind of presence. You need to be able to condition, other partners to allow your presence and to respond very quickly if there's something that threatens any part of your bloodstream. And this is what America, frankly, sort of forgot about. We had a series of things in the 80s. Ronald Reagan started to remove the subsidies to the maritime industry, and this was sort of the beginning of the end in terms of our true maritime power. So today, America is a naval power. We are not a maritime power. China is a maritime power and a naval power with more warships than we have, although our tonnage is still greater.
Calvin.
I was just going to go back, Mike, where you talked about China, the investment of China in terms of the maritime domain, to build their capabilities and capacity in that area. And I see, with the NATO conversations, this increased narrative relative to investment in drones and in other military technology. But I see a vacant space, say, for example, in terms of building that capability in the maritime area, in the ports, the infrastructure for it, the security for it. We're still using, in many ports, Chinese-made monitoring systems. I look at AI, we're not looking at, do we have the best AI that are shared with corporate Canada, corporate North America, corporate NATO, in terms of looking at supply chains. What would you say to investors, venture capitalists, and CEOs relative to the importance of having a more balanced approach in terms of investment and foreign investment, in terms of within allies and with our own countries in this space?
Yeah, as we go back to sort of everything has to be viewed through the security lens now, unfortunately, it's just an added burden. We have to think about companies with an international presence or investment sort of strategy need to sort of find their patriotism again, given sort of the stakes of the trajectories here. And if we're not careful, we're going to find that um, we will be living in a world where Chinese domination and leverage is so powerful and so strong that essentially it immobilizes our freedom of action and ultimately will affect not just sort of the national security, it's sort of a vague notion of it, but it will affect the maneuverability of companies, and they're going to find that they have positioned themselves in near term for profit, which in long term creates their own prison cells in many ways, right? And so I think companies understand this. I think they've all been burnt to some extent in maybe looking at the promise of the China market. But I do think you're right that we need to say, hey, it's not just a problem of companies in the West that are, you know, finding that the Chinese stole their trade secrets as a part of the contract for doing business in China and then now competed them. This is, hey, the Chinese have gone out and their presence is so significant in terms of IT presence, in terms of talking about ZPMC cranes and the ability to move that data back um, that they have undue leverage, which is just not wise. They may or may not use it, but if you take a look at how the Chinese have been able to exploit every lever that they might have at their disposal, suitable to the purposes that they're aiming for, then nothing is off the table. I once asked some China experts, I said, people ask me what's the difference between malign and benign Chinese action. And the answer that this group of Chinese experts gave was anything can be malign under any given condition. Therefore, nothing is truly benign and stays that way. Therefore, you have to be on your guard and wary of how close you get to the Chinese, how much access you give to the Chinese, what you buy from the Chinese, etc. And so this means that we have to become more maybe self-reliant, or we have to for different partnerships within trusted countries, this friendshoring, nearshoring kind of stuff that people have talked about. How do you reduce supply chain risk? How do you have a smarter investment strategy? Those kinds of things, I think, Calvin, what you're talking about are exactly it's sort of the right approach. I think the conversation's been had for a number of years now. I know for certain, since I was leading in one of my hats, White House activities to look at our port infrastructure and what would take to actually reduce the dependency on Chinese cranes and other things. And so, look, the Coast Guard, maritime capabilities, port authorities, National Command Authority, we've taken significant strides in reducing some of those vulnerabilities that you were sort of alluding to. But the work is not finished. And I think it's more expansive than people understand. And it will require, I think, a refocus in terms of what venture capitalists invest in. And look, it's time to really invest more in the West, I think, and lose some of um, the sort of optimism that things will just go back to normal and we can just do re-engagement again and it'll all be fine. That's just not the world that I see or you see, I think.
So before we wrap up, I also want to touch on the impact of being able to have maritime security, what it has on our ability to operate in the cloud, because the cloud really isn't in the cloud. So much of it runs under the sea. And we've seen that there are a tremendous number of operations that have taken place where there's cutting of cables. This happens under the darkness of the water. Are we able to defend against these kinds of threats that lead to economic disruption?
Yeah, I mean, the people have been awakened too about the subsea infrastructure and cables, and they've sort of seen a totally different world, a frontier that they never had to think about, and that's a good thing. At the same time, there's been a lot of action to try to figure out ways to monitor undersea infrastructure. There are a couple of ways you can do that. You can actually look for interruptions in sort of the rhythm and flow of light over fiber optic cables to sense whether or not there are any disturbances that are there on the comms cables. And also, there are a number of different companies that are already, selling a lot of their drone systems that are on the surface or subsea. They can sort of monitor the critical infrastructure and sense changes that are there and report more promptly, if something is untoward. I think 10 cables were cut in the Baltic, right, with the Russians and the Chinese collaborating together to do that with merchant ships dragging their anchors and other ways that did that. And so you now have kind of the Baltic Century operation from NATO to put more of a presence up there to handle that. But obviously, there are other areas in the oceans where the cables exist and where we have to monitor suspicious ships that have been associated with this sort of stuff, the dark fleets that we talked about. And, the Houthis also demonstrated that, look, relatively weak non-state actor, not just a nation state, can do this. I think they cut in the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, there are like 15 sea cables, sometime in the 23, 24, time period. There are natural cuts that occur when ships sort of drag anchor and storms and things like that. But now it's very purposeful in certain areas to penalize countries with these gray zone operations. And so capability exists. I think the motivations are there to do more about it. That doesn't eliminate the threat. There's just too much vastness, too many places where you might be able to, sever things. And so we need to think about it, the protect side for us in a way that is on track, but it's certainly not a mission that's been accomplished yet.
So, the way that I hear our conversation is that this is a collective, all of us. We have to recognize that what's happening at sea affects all of us. And we need to influence policymakers to say, you have to put the resources, the time, and the effort into protecting these vital international waterways that affect our economy. As a closing thought from you, what is the message that you want to send, especially to corporation CEOs and policymakers, as to what you would like to see them focus on here in the short term and maybe out over the next 2 or 3 years?
Well, I do think going back to our original conversation, we need an eyes wide open assessment of the nature of our world, and we need a framework for understanding it. And I think that deserves public-private conversations about, what it is that we're all seeing, and then how we're going to deal with it arm in arm. I just don't think that in today's world that threats are sort of government business. It's just not true. I think that government is going to become more highly dependent on private industry to solve, collective problems. I think multiple governments will have to collaborate together to address things, and we need to do so on a basis of trust, which means setting the environment for trust needs to be there. Um, and frankly, the more we do in the space the way we've been describing, the more legitimate our actions will be seen, and the more that maybe other nations or other actors will move in this space here, and we can begin to isolate the more belligerent actors from affecting us this deeply. But until such time as we get public-private to have the right kind of conversations at all levels, not just for profiteering, not giving special access because you know somebody in the White House. I'm talking about real substantial conversations about what it will take to conduct economic statecraft in the future in a way that's mutually supportive. That to me is the most important thing to get right. In a world of tomorrow, this statecraft can't be just the reserve of the state if we're going to do it the right way. That would be my message.
Thank you. Closing thoughts from you, Calvin?
No, Mike, thanks very much. I had the opportunity, as I said before the show, to work with some of your colleagues historically. And as you know, our show is based in the Vancouver area, which is a heavily dependent in the terms of the marine domain. And having lived and worked in the threat environment, I sadly have an immense appreciation of the importance of the marine environment and how that cascades into all other threat activities and threat streams. And really appreciate you joining the show. And I without talking to Stu, I'd like to have you back because I think this is one of the biggest vulnerabilities that we have. Everybody's talking about the Arctic, and I appreciate the Arctic has its own domain and issues, but I really think this marine domain, knowing particularly the economic implications for it, is probably one of the most critical areas, and needs a lot more dialogue in terms of if we're going to try to assist and support furthering, global resilience amongst our allies and NATO countries. So thanks very much for joining us.
No, I passionately agree. So, Stu and Calvin, thanks for the opportunity to talk about it. I look forward to coming back on, maybe talk more detail some of these issues.
Yes, we can drill down, which would be fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you for all who joined us online. We will be back on July 22nd when we look at the role of AI in national cyber and financial defense. Until then, this is Security Disruptors.